let's go ahead and get started. Lord, today, again, we're thankful we can come before you. We can open your word, and we can partake of what you have for us. Pray, Lord, you'll anoint your word as it goes out. Anoint my lips to say those things that you have said, and anoint our hearts to receive. And we thank you in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen. All right, tonight we're going to continue in our study of Judges, the 19th chapter, and this is kind of an interesting story. Now, apparently this story takes place probably in the, well, it does, we find out next week, that it takes place in the early days of the conquest of Canaan. So it happened probably perhaps before or during the judgeship of Ehud. So that's how far back this story takes place. When we first look at it, it looks like it's a continuation from the Levite that we were looking at last week. But actually, we'll find out as we find out next week. It was much earlier in the period of the Judges.
And that was in the time of who?
Probably Ehud, the first judge.
Ehud.
Ehud, E-H-U-D. Now, as we talk, this is not necessarily in chronological order, the book of Judges. Some of it is. The Judges seem to come in pretty much order. But these stories at the end, they appear throughout the different time frames of what is Judges. And we know that Ruth, we talked about that, that happened probably in the mid-range of the Judges. And so, it's really hard to put any kind of chronological order on these. And they weren't necessarily meant to be that, because they're kind of standalone stories that tell us how God wanted to rule in Canaan and the problems that came up and how he dealt with them in those situations. All right, so let's read Judges chapter 19, and we're going to read the first 14 verses. And it came to pass in those days, when there was no king in Israel. Now, we've heard this before, haven't we? That meant there was nobody, no central ruler, so each tribe had its own set of rules, and they ruled their tribe and were expected to keep their tribe in line. It was kind of peer pressure. If one tribe didn't do what they were supposed to, they had peer pressure that was working on them to get back in line. And we'll see how well that works tonight and next week. All right. There was no king in Israel, that there was. All right, so let me read again. And it came to pass in those days, when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine played the harlot against him, and went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there for 4 whole months. Then her husband arose and went after her, to speak kindly to her and bring her back, having his servant and a couple of donkeys with him. So she brought him into her father's house, and when the father of the young woman saw him, he was glad to meet him. Now his father-in-law, the young woman's father, detained him, and he stayed with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and lodged there. Then it came to pass on the 4th day that they arose early in the morning, and he stood to depart. But the young woman's father said to his son-in-law, "Refresh your heart with a morsel of bread, and afterward go on your way." So they sat down, and the two of them ate and drank together. Then the young woman's father said to the man, "Please be content to stay all night, and let your heart be merry." And when the man stood to depart, his father-in-law urged him, so he lodged there again. Then he arose early in the morning on the 5th day to depart, but the young woman's father said, "Please refresh your heart." So they delayed until afternoon, and both of them ate. And when the man stood to depart, he and his concubine and his servant, his father-in-law, the young woman's father, said to him, "Look, The day is now drawing toward evening. Please spend the night. See, the day is coming to an end. Lodge here that your heart may be merry. Tomorrow go your way early so that you may get home. However, the man was not willing to spend that night, so he rose and departed and came opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem. With him were the 2 saddled donkeys. His concubine was also with him. And we assume the servant too, by the way. However, the man, verse 11, they were near Jebus, and the day was far spent, and the servant said to his master, come, please, let us turn aside into this city of the Jebusites and lodge in it. But his master said to him, we will not turn aside here into a city of foreigners who are not of the children of Israel. We will go on to Geba. So he said to his servant, come, let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night in Geba or in Ramah. And they passed by and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Geba, which belongs to Benjamin. Okay, so here's what happened. Now we're going to find out next week in chapter 20 that Phinehas, who was the grandson of Aaron, was the high priest at Shiloh during this time. We'll find that out next week. So that lets us know that it had to be early in the conquest of Canaan, long before last week's lesson or in any of those. So it had to be very early on, because Phinehas was himself an old man when they went into the promised land. So, it wasn't very long after that. So the Levites, of which this man was, now they were set aside to be priests, and of course as such they had certain restrictions. For instance, they could not own land. And for that reason, the Levites were not given any land in Canaan. They had to stay on land that belonged to one of the other tribes. Now, one of the tribes split, of course, and so the 12 tribes do not line up with the 12 sons of Abraham necessarily, because 2 of them came out of Joseph. If you'll remember, there were the 2 tribes that came out of Joseph. The Levites were not numbered as one of the 12. They were actually the 13th tribe, but they were set aside to be priests, and so therefore they had certain restrictions. They had to dress a certain way. They couldn't own land. But what they could do was just about anything else. They could hold business. They could run a business. They could farm. They had to use somebody else's land, but most of them were farmers. They could also run businesses. They could get married. They could have concubines. They could do whatever the rest of the nation did. So while they had some restrictions, they also were still Israelites and had the freedoms that they had. Now their function was to perform the priestly duties in all Israel. That meant wherever they were expected to perform those duties. Now there were a lot of duties that were performed outside of temple worship, or tabernacle worship in this case. They still had to have the cleansing ceremonies. For instance, a woman had a baby, she had to wait 30 days, and then she had to show herself to the priest. And they had to go out and dip themselves, and all of that sort of thing. So these people that lived in the hills of Ephraim or back away from Shiloh, where the ark was, you couldn't expect them to travel 3 days just to show themselves to a priest. So the priests were there for these duties. And so they led worship and whatever in the outlying areas, and that's what this priest was. Now, he was evidently not hired by a private individual. The mountains of Ephraim, he lived back in the hills of Ephraim. That's where Shiloh was. And we'll find out later that he was headed back to Shiloh, and he starts to head home. So the idea here, or the assumption is, he was probably one of those priests who took turns going to Shiloh and ministering priestly duties before the ark in the tabernacle at Shiloh. Because what would happen, these priests would work for maybe a period of 2 weeks or a month in the tabernacle, and then they go home and they farm or whatever, and another crew would come in and take care of the tabernacle. So they weren't 24 hours, 365 days a year priests at Shiloh. They took turns going there to minister before the ark. And so he was probably one of those Levites who did that. Now we know he was not necessarily a wealthy man, but he was well-to-do because he had 2 donkeys.
Yeah.
That was a sign that you had some status. He had 2 donkeys. And he had a servant, at least one. So we know the man was probably not a high-ranking priest, but at least somewhat up in the order of the priesthood, so that he was making a pretty good living. What I find is interesting is that he took a concubine. Now, we have to understand some things about concubines. Let me read this to you. Maybe this will help kind of understand. Concubine was a female slave who functioned as a secondary wife and surrogate mother. The Hebrew word for concubine, which is pelagius, is a non-semantic loan word borrowed to refer to a phenomenon not indigenous to Israel. Babylonian and Assyrian law codes regulate primary and secondary marriages more specifically than do the Old Testament laws of Exodus 21, 7-10. If a man, this is what Exodus says, if a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has betrothed her to himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt deceitfully with her. And if he has betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her according to the customs of daughters. If he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, and her marriage rights. And if he does not do these 3 for her, then she shall go out free without paying money. Concubines are mentioned primarily in the early Israelite history. During patriarchal times, the period of the judges and the early monarchy, although some later kings also had concubines. While concubines did not have the same status as wives, they were not to be mistreated, and that's Exodus 7-10, nor could they be violated by other males, according to Genesis 35 and 22, with impunity, Genesis 49, 3-4. They seem to have received higher status if they bore sons, or at least they are remembered by name. And some of these we find in Genesis 21 and 10, 22, 24, 30 and 3, 36 and 12. These are all by Baker's, by the way, Evangelical Dictionary. So to kind of sum this up, a man could take a wife. Now, if you were going to take a wife, we've kind of gone over how that worked. You got your father, and he talked to her father, and you had this negotiation thing, and you gave him, and you basically paid for the wife, but it was done through the father, and everything was kind of, very high class, and you had to wait, and this whole ceremony of picking up a wife. That would be your primary wife, or a primary wife, because they could have more than one. If, on the other hand, you didn't have either the social standing or the finances, or you didn't have a father, or there were several other things that might arise that would hinder you from going through this process of taking a wife. But you still wanted to have a wife, you could just buy one. And this was your secondary wife, and that they called a concubine. Now, some people have said, oh, concubines were nothing more than prostitutes. No, that's not true. Some of them were, but most of the time, frankly, they were women nobody wanted. And I think we're going to see that here with this particular woman. And I don't mean that they were, they were obnoxious, but maybe they had attitude problems. If you had a daughter and you couldn't control her, what was the chances anybody else was going to want her? They weren't going to negotiate. I was going to say, "I'll just take her. I'll pay you." I mean, sometimes you run into those kind of women. Now, at some point, this concubine decided to play the harlot and run away. Now, playing the harlot doesn't mean she started being a prostitute. That's our first assumption. That isn't what it meant. Harlot means that he turned her back on her husband. Turned her back on him. And she ran away. Now, Josephus, of course, Josephus, he was a few hundred years behind this, but he writes, and his writing is that she left because they were constantly fighting. And this, if this is true, it kind of tells me, when I tie it into what a concubine kind of came from, she may have had a major attitude issue. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. I don't care if I am a slave. You're just not going to tell me what to do. And you run into people like that. They're always right, or they're going to push their point, right or wrong, and they're going to start a fight because that's what they like doing. And maybe that was her problem. But for whatever cause, she took off and wasn't supposed to leave unless the husband threw her out.
Oh.
She could leave if she wanted to pay, or if her father wanted to pay. She could be redeemed back, but only if the husband. She was there. She was a slave. She had no rights to do anything. And here she is. She takes off and runs away. So this is probably a very disconcerting situation for this young man. He's a priest. He's expected to be a holy man, and take things. Also, he may very well have been ministering in Shiloh at the time. So going after her would have been an issue because he's doing his duties at Shiloh. Whatever reason, we don't know, but he waited 4 whole months, before he took off after her. Now, the distance from where he lived around Shiloh is a good day's journey. daylight journey. Probably someplace in the neighborhood 6 to 8 hours journey. So you could do it in one day. It wasn't really that far. It was approximately, I just kind of did some rough calculations, about 16 to 18 miles from Bethlehem to Shiloh, where the ark was, in the area where he lived. All right, so he took a servant, and he took 2 donkeys, and he went to her father's house, and it says it went with the intent of, how does it, the king, James put it here, to speak kindly to her and bring her back. The actual translation of that comes back to speak to her heart. In other words, he was going to, apologize, and he was going to romanticize her to convince her to come back with him. So really, this is kind of a nice little love story part of it here. You do this. So they get to Bethlehem, to her house, and she takes him in to meet her father. And the father was glad to see him. That tells me a couple of things. It tells me, number one, he wanted to get her out of the house again. I mean, she was probably causing trouble. I'm so glad to see you. You want to leave with her? Take her. But at the same time, there were the culture of hospitality. And the culture of hospitality said that if you have a stranger or this kind of a situation, you were expected to put them up for some time until, they were well rested and all. And I'm sure the father probably loved his daughter too, And excuse me a moment. I don't want to talk to him right now. Should have shut that off. So she loved him, or he loved her, and it was his daughter, no matter what kind of problem she may have been causing. And I'm sure he wanted to give this Levite plenty of time to do his romanticizing and talking and making sure she was going to go with him and stay with him this time. And so 3 days they stayed. And on the 4th day, he got up and he's ready to go. And the father detained him. And he did this by telling him, hey, look, you really shouldn't go yet until you had something to eat. It's a long journey. Now, in those days, by the way, they didn't eat breakfast like we do. I mean, I get up in the morning. I'm up at 7 or 8 o'clock, by 8:30 or so. I'm ready to eat by 7:30, 8 o'clock. I'm kind of ready. I want my coffee, and I'm going to fix something to eat and whatever. Elma, she doesn't eat breakfast until usually later. Once in a while, if I can entice her with hash browns, she'll eat. But otherwise, she's not much of a morning eater. I, on the other hand, I like my breakfast. That's one of my big meals. But over there, in their culture, they didn't eat much for breakfast. Maybe they'd have a piece of cheese or something. And then about between 10 and 12 was their morning meal. And that's when they really ate what we would consider a breakfast or a complete meal. And so what was happening here was the Levite was getting up early, expecting to leave early, because he's got an 8-hour journey to get home. He didn't want to be, at night and want to get home. Well, the father says, well, you really shouldn't go until you've had your meal. Culture says, I can't really let you go until I feed you. I mean, that was the culture, and that was what was expected. The rules of hospitality. And so that first day, he fed them, and then, maybe they got into some deep theological discussions. I don't know. If it was like around my house, if I'm at my brother's house, or when my father was alive and we'd be together, a simple meal could go in for hours. Because, we're talking. Because I don't talk much anymore. But anyway, I thought you were going to choke on that one. It could go on for hours. And evidently they got to talking, and they're drinking and, they're talking. Now, of course, as we mentioned before, the wine over there was a very low alcohol content, so it was more, you know, it wasn't so much that anybody was inebriated, but they were just enjoying themselves, enjoying the conversations, and it became late. Well, it's too late to go. So, okay, we'll spend another night. And they got up on the 5th day. Same thing again. We'll wait. You know, we'll eat, and they got to talking, and it became late. However, the young man, this time he refused to spend the night. Now, there's probably a lot of reasons for this, why this whole thing was interacting. May have been, for instance, maybe the father really wanted to get to know his son-in-law, because they were actually married. They just were not married as primary wife. It was considered being married as a secondary wife, but he was still his father-in-law to the son-in-law, and you know, there was still that relationship. He may have wanted to get to know them better. Perhaps he wanted to make sure that their problems were taken care of, and they were, you know, going to make it this time. There was also the possibility that he really didn't want to let his daughter go. There was that possibility also. So there was a lot of things at play here that we don't really know the answers to. We do know that the father-in-law's persistence at keeping his father-in-law there, or keeping his son-in-law and daughter there, actually led to the catastrophe that we're going to read about in a little later. And sometimes our best intentions, even though we think we know what we're doing and why we're doing it, we misread a situation. He probably thought, well, yeah, the Levite will wait another day. However, there's also this situation we have to think about. He was a Levite. He was expected to be home on the Sabbath. He could not travel on the Sabbath. This was the 5th day he had been at his father's house, a father-in-law's house. That meant it took a day to get there. So assuming he left the day after Sabbath and traveled a day's journey, he's now bumping up on a problem if he doesn't get home before sunset the next day. It would have been Sabbath. And I'm sure he had duties to perform too on the Sabbath as a priest. So he wanted to get home. I know if Rick is out of town or has to do something, he wants to be back by Saturday because he has to get ready for Sunday. I know how much work goes into getting ready for a Sunday service. And even though we do the same things over and over again, that sermon may take all day to put together.
Yeah.
So, you know, there was things that needed to be done. And the father didn't take this into account. So there was some sort of that might have been a feeling that, you know, he had to get this thing situated before his son-in-law and daughter left. And it may have been more a selfish attitude than an attitude that was best for everybody. At any rate, on the 5th day, instead of the son-in-law saying, okay, we'll stay one more night, he said, no, we have got to leave. And when you read this, it says it was already late in the afternoon. That meant they were not going to get all the way home. They would have to stop somewhere along the line to spend the night. Now, from Shiloh to Bethlehem, I said it's about 16 miles. When you left Jerusalem, or left Bethlehem, it was about when you left Jerusalem, it was about 3 miles to Gabah. Another 3 miles to Ramah. So it wasn't a real long distance, but it was far enough that, you know, it was going to be a long journey. Jerusalem was about 6 miles from Bethlehem. So you travel the 6 miles at 2 miles an hour, you know, that's about 3 hours. And then you're going to have to go another half to get to Gibah, and then you got another hour and a half to get to Ramah, if you were going to Ramah, at least. And these are my estimates, you know, just based on following the road that they traveled. So it was already late afternoon. And so they were on the road, and they're headed now toward home. Now, you know, if you kind of looked at this, you'd see a Levite, and he's got one donkey, and it's got all of her stuff on it. Because she probably left with a donkey or had somebody ship all of her stuff home. So he's got all of her stuff on one donkey. She's probably riding on the other donkey. And here's her servant and him, and each of them's got a donkey, and they're headed down the road, the four of them, when they head home, the three of them and the two donkeys. Well, it says it was late in the afternoon as they passed the town of Jebus. Jebus is now called Jerusalem. And we talked about this back in the first chapter of Judges. You remember how Caleb's family came and took the city of Jerusalem. However, they did not take the fort of Zion, which was a fortress that was inside the city, but it was in the back part of the city. You remember Zion Hill? We were up on Zion Hill. Well, that was a fortress during the time of the Judges. And Jerusalem itself, the town of Jebus, was just a small town. And the family of Caleb had taken the town, and it belonged to them. But in the years after that, not long after that, the Jebusites were able to take the city back because people in the town didn't obey God. And the Bible says, turned it over to the Jebusites. So it was now a Jebusite town. Now these Jebusites were the same ones who were out antagonizing Israel. You know, they were some of them that were going out and taking the crops and all this kind of things because they had a fort right there in the middle of things. So they just come out and take everything, go back in their fort. Who's going to bother them? And so this Levite, when he came by, his servant said, hey, let's turn in here and let's spend the night here. But the Levite said, no, I don't want to go in here because it's a bunch of foreigners, and I don't want to be around a bunch of foreigners. Now his remarks about foreigners had to be the fact that these were people who were not Jews, who were mistreating the Jews. Mm-hmm. So this wasn't just somebody from another country. These were the ones that were causing a lot of the problems in the area, and he didn't want to stay in their city. So there was a certain amount of fear of what might happen if they went into this city. And that's really normal, isn't it? We sometimes fear about being around people who are of this world or maybe are violent in this world. We don't want to be around them because we have a fear for our lives or for our whatever, reputations in some case. I know, of course in CMA we have rules and regulations like any things we do and don't do. But one thing we do is we go into taverns or bars. We'll go into a tavern, bar, and sit down. We don't drink. We make sure we get cans of Coke or something that's obvious it's not a drink. And we'll talk to people. I mean, we'll play pool with them. I don't. You don't ever want to see me play pool. I mean, that kind of, they throw me out for tearing things up. I'm not a pool player. But I mean, we do whatever and talk to people. I mean, we just go in there. Is it dangerous sometimes? Yeah, sometimes it's a little spooky, especially if it's a biker bar, which is usually where we're at. And it can get a little. I don't know, these guys look pretty mean and ornery. But if you show the right attitude, they don't bother you. They don't bother you. In fact, sometimes they'll come right over and talk to you. It's funny though, one of the guys, he happens to be an officer, he has not around this stuff very much. And he was we stopped on a run, and we stopped at it was a bar and grill. We stopped. Some of the guys hadn't had dinner, so they were going to eat. They knew they had good food there, and so we stopped at this bar and grill. And him and his wife said, "I don't think we're going to try this yet." Booked on home. We were about done with the ride anyway. But some people just don't feel comfortable in that kind of a situation. this man did not feel comfortable going into that situation. Now, we can justify it. I mean, he was not on a missions trip. However, he was a Levite. He was a priest. And there, I think, remained a certain responsibility. Even though the Jews did not go out and look for people to come join the Jewish faith. Now, that doesn't happen today. But at the same time, there needed to be somebody who could go in and show that we're a godly people. That we love God. Our God is a supreme God. How are they ever going to know that? The only way they ever found any of that out was through Elijah or you know, one of the judges or somebody called fire out of heaven. I mean, that was the way they found out. They never found out about the love of God or how much God really cares for people. And it's magnified today. We need to not be so fearful for ourselves. Really, when it comes down to it, most of us are afraid of is somebody will see us go in there. Really. What will they think? I came out of an organization very, 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 very strict. And the reason we didn't do things wasn't because we didn't think the Bible said we couldn't do it. It was more about if we did it and somebody saw us, we'd be in trouble.
Yeah.
What would the pastor say? You know, what would the superintendent say? We were more afraid of what somebody else was going to think than what we needed to do in order to reach people. And if I pull something out of this portion of this scripture, it is that we need to not be so afraid of where we are and what we're doing. We need to fear more for the people of the place that we need to go into. Not that they'll hurt us, but that they won't hear about Jesus if we don't go in there and do something.
Right.
You see? And we'll see this Levite made a big mistake here. And I wonder, and we'll read on here a little bit, but I wonder if sometimes some of the things that trouble we get into is kind of God saying, hey, you know, I wanted you to do this and you didn't do it because of fear, so now I'm going to bring the thing you feared on you. You know, God has a way of doing things. And sometimes it's not easy for us. Sometimes it's not pleasant. But it's what God has to do sometimes to wake us up. All right, so they came to the city, and the Levite says, no, we're not going to stop here. We're going to go on either to Gibeah or to Ramah before we stop for the night. Now, both of these cities belong to the tribe of Benjamin. Now, you remember, these were the guys that were trained to be soldiers from the time they were babies. You know, they tie their right hand, so they had to learn to fight with their left hands because they were left-handed soldiers, and we'll see that next week. So this was a very warlike people, the Benjamites. They were the ones you wanted on your side if you were going to have a battle. But they were also very independent. And so they were very much, because they had, I think, my opinion, because they were raised to be military men, they had this military attitude throughout the tribe. And we see it today, you know, if you watch programs like SEAL Team or some of these things, you know, and the soldiers are more connected to their fellow soldiers sometimes than they are to their own families. They've learned to depend on each other. They've learned to, if they don't work together, they're going to die, you know. And so they have this feeling of camaraderie that was missing maybe in the other tribes. And so and we'll see next week how this feeling of camaraderie, how it plays out against the other 11 tribes of Israel. All right, so they decided to wait, and so they headed on their way toward Gibeah. So let's pick it up at verse 15. They turned aside there to go in to lodge in Gib'ah. So they had arrived at Gib'ah. The sun just went down on them as they arrived at Gib'ah. Now they could have gone the next 3 miles on to Ramah. However, that would have meant they would have been traveling in the dark. And in those days, you didn't want to travel at night unless you had some armed men with you. There were a lot of thieves, bandits, and also the roads weren't like they are today. You weren't working on concrete, they were trails, and you just basically were winding through the hills on trails. All kinds of reasons why you didn't want to travel even an hour and a half further to get to the next town. So they decided to stop at Gib'ah. They turned aside there to go in to lodge in Gib'ah, and when they went in, they sat down in the open square of the city, for no one would take them into his house to spend the night. Just then an old man came in from his work in the field at evening, who was also from the mountains of Ephraim. He was staying in Gib'ah, whereas the men of the place were Benjamites. And when he raised his eyes, he saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, "Where are you going? And where do you come from?" So he said to them, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah toward the remote mountains of Ephraim, for I am from there. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, now I am going to the house of the Lord. But there is no one who will take me into his house. Although we have both straw and fodder for our donkeys, and bread and wine for myself, for your female servant, and for the young man who is with your servant, there is no lack of anything." And the old man said, "Peace be with you. However, let all your needs be in my responsibility. Only do not spend the night in the open square." So he brought them into his house and gave fodder to the donkeys, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. So here we have, there's no detail about what happened here when they came into the city. But evidently when they came in, they looked first of all for an inn or a commercial, what we would call an inn, a hotel. Some of the cities had them, some did not. And so they began to ask of people, "Can we stay at your home?" Does this kind of sound familiar? The story of Jesus, they're looking around for a place and they couldn't find any place that would take them in.
Yeah.
Well, at first glimpse, you would say, well, probably these people were obnoxious. They were Benjamites, and they probably didn't like anybody. They just didn't want to have any travelers. Or it could have been that they were full. The houses were full, although that doesn't seem to be anything going on of any great import that would cause extra people to be there that we know of. But they just simply refused to let these people into their house. And I think we'll find later in this chapter the reason was fear. These people were afraid to have anybody, any stranger, in their house. And it was because of the wickedness of the city. When you allow wickedness to take over a city, what happens is you begin to live in fear. I think this is a great example right here. Used to be, you'd come down to church, you never worried about anything. You came down to church, came in. This isn't the best neighborhood in town, but we never had any problems. There was no reason to worry about anything. Hey, you just come down. This city has become so wicked. This area, this part of Washington has become so wicked, we don't even dare come down here alone. We have to have something with us to protect us. It's out of fear. Why do we do that? they've broken in. You know, there's homeless guys out here. Some have been threatened. They break into the cars. They throw trash in the parking lots. I mean, you know, they dumped a whole trailer load of garbage out here one day, right out in the parking lot. You know, there's all this stuff going on, and there are others that are, their churches are being burned and people are being beaten. This stuff is going on in our town, and it's gotten to the point where we can't feel free like we should. We fear when we come here. That should not be the case. But when you allow evil to take over an area, what follows, and always follows, is fear. Everybody says, oh, you know, hey, we'll let this happen, and whoa, everything's going to be just fine. It doesn't work that way. It works just the opposite. And these people were afraid to allow anybody into their home. Notice who lets them in. It's the old man from Ephraim, probably the tribe of Manasseh. Now, they were in the square. Now, we kind of get the wrong impression here from the village square. We think about in the middle of town, you know, they have a nice square. What this was the area just inside the gates. This is where they carried on business. They held court. You know, we talked about being in the gates. Well, this was the square, or the big open area, just as you went through the gates, and there was usually this whole open area. And this is where business was carried on, and all of this sort of thing. It was all shut down for the night. Now, one of the reasons they went to Geba and not on to Ramah is because after the sun goes down, it didn't take very long for them to close the gates. All the workers, when the sun goes down, they head back to town. They come through the gates, they close and bar the gates, and you don't get into town. So even if they had wanted to go to Ramah, they would have probably got to Ramah and the gates would have been closed. So this was really their only option at this point. So here they are, just inside the gates. They're probably got their big coats on. They're rolled up on the ground and they're camping for the night. Got their donkeys down. When the old man comes through the gate. Now, it's interesting, they call him an old man, and yet he's coming from working in the fields. I don't know how old he was, but I could probably still work in the fields, at least 10 or 15 minutes. But anyway, what he probably was, since he was not a resident of the city, it appears that he was probably a migrant or farm worker who came to Geba to work during the harvest or the planting, whatever the season was. We're not told what season it was. And then he would probably go home. He may have a house there in Geba that he rented. Now, we know his daughter was with him. We'll find that out in a bit. And probably his wife also, although that's not mentioned. So they probably came to Geba and worked and then went back into the hills of Ephraim during the off-season. Not unlike what we do today. There's a lot of people that travel and work and then they go home. And you know, that was just kind of the life of those in those times. But he was probably from the tribe of Manasseh. And so when he sees them sitting there, oh, by the way, now these were Benjamites. They were of Israel. There were cultural, social, and even the law itself laid out what you were supposed to do when a stranger came to your town. Even more so when the stranger was of Israel. You were to open your home and to give them hospitality. There were the laws of hospitality. These people were violating the laws of hospitality. Now, they were probably doing so out of fear, but they were still violating the law. Could they possibly expect God to bless them when they were so afraid to bless others? Boy, does that sound kind of familiar to some people? You know, they don't want to do anything for anybody. Yeah, just go away and leave me alone. I'm going to serve God, and that's my thing, and you all just go someplace. But the laws of hospitality still apply today. We should open ourselves to strangers. I don't mean take everybody home with you, you know. Now, my mother, that's the opposite. If somebody would come to church, I mean, they couldn't make it out the door before she had them. And I've got dinner prepared, you come on over to our house, especially if it was a sailor. We were down in Long Beach and there was the big port there, the naval base was open at that time. And so we had sailors and all over the place, you know. Someone would come to church, come on to my house. And I had more sailors, more brothers in the Navy, you know. A couple of them I've tried to reach out to, you know, and I have never found them. But we had one that stayed with me for a week. He was my big brother. But she'd open the house, you know, and my dad, he was more, I mean, he didn't mind. I mean, it wasn't that, but, you know, he would sometimes say, you need to be a little more careful about who we're letting in the house, you know. Oh, that's all right, I'll take care of it. Oh, she'd fix big meals, you know, so that was my mom. I mean, nobody was a stranger. Everybody come to the house. But that's kind of the way God expects us to be, not so much in our personal homes, although I think we should be outgoing and invite people, but certainly when they come in the door, people should immediately respond to them. Now we have greeters and things, you know, and people shake hands, and that's good to have you here, you know. But what do we do after that? How do we show hospitality after that? Oh, we got some cookies and coffee over here for you. Oh, that's nice. But how do we show hospitality after that? And we're working on some things now. Pastor and Ricky and I are working on some things. So we're going to get some things going in the areas of discipleship and outreach when people come in our doors, rather than come in, oh, we're so glad you're here, come visit us again someday, and we don't see them again, don't talk to them again. We need to outreach. We need to love these people. We need to let them know they're welcome, and some other things that we need to be doing. So we're going to be working on that. But this is what these people were not doing. And we're going to find next week what that led to happening to the town of Gilboa. It wasn't good. It wasn't good. This old man came in. He saw him in the city streets and began to talk to him. He found out that, hey, I'm from the hills of Ephraim. You know, we're fellow countrymen. And this is a Levite who's ministering in his district, in his area. And so he immediately opened his home. One thing you're not going to do is stay out here in the square. Of course, he also knew what was in that town. He says, you're going to come home with me. And what I want you to notice here, not only did he invite him into his home, and the priest said, you know, we've got our food for our animals, we've got food for us, and you don't have to provide anything. We're self-sufficient. We're running our own little RV here with everything in it that we need. Yeah. This donkey's got everything on him I need. Well, that was fine and good. But the old man said, peace be with you. However, let all your needs be my responsibility. I'm going to take over all of your needs. You're not going to need anything. I'm going to make sure you have everything. In those days, they carried, every time they went someplace, they took a supply of food and wine with them. And it was kind of like an emergency supply. You know, if they couldn't find any place to stay, they could stay out by the road. Really, it was kind of like we do in RVs today. You know, you pack your RV or your camp trailer and you take off, and you know, if you don't find a place to eat, no big deal. You pull over the side of the road, make a sandwich, cook a roast, cook a steak, whatever you want to do, however much time you have dinner, and go on your way. Well, that's the way it was then. But he said, I don't want you to use any of those supplies. You're in my house, and when you're in my house, it's my responsibility. You know, isn't that like Jesus? He said, when you come into my house, you're my responsibility. You leave all that stuff out there on the donkey. Don't even unpack it. Just leave it on the donkey. I'm going to take care of you as long as you're in my house. And as long as we're in the house of God, He will take care of us. Now, as humans, we can't always fulfill our obligations, but we can try. And this old man, he decided to take on that responsibility. So he brought him into his house, he gave fodder to the donkeys, and they washed their feet, and they ate and drank. Now, I think the most important thing there was the washing of their feet. He did when they washed their home. But the washing of the feet was a sign of hospitality that went beyond just saying, well, you get to wash before you eat, which was part of the law, get the dust off your feet and whatever. It was also a sign of protection. You are under my roof, therefore I am protecting you. Take off your shoes, wash your feet, relax, because I am going to be your protection. I think it's interesting that part of the whole armor of God that Paul talks about is being shod with the preparation of the gospel, having something on your feet. If you're going to defend yourself, you've got to have your feet shod. And the rules of hospitality said, since your host is your protector, you can take off your shoes. You can go barefoot. You don't have to worry. And so he was operating with the Levite, the servant, and the concubine under the rules of hospitality. So what happened? Start reading at verse 22. As they were enjoying themselves, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, "Bring out the man who came to your house, that we may know him carnally." But the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly. Seeing this man has come into my house, do not commit this outrage. Look, here is my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let me bring them out now. Humble them and do to them as you please, but to this man do not do such a vile thing." But the men would not heed him. So the man, that's the Levite, took his concubine and brought her out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until morning. And when the day began to break, they let her go. Then the woman came as the day was dawning, and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, till it was light. When her master arose in the morning and opened the doors of the house and went out to go his way, there was his concubine, fallen at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, "Get up and let us be going." But there was no answer. So the man lifted her onto the donkey, and the man got up and went to his place. This story so parallels the story of Genesis 19. You remember Sodom and Gomorrah?
Yeah.
It was such a wicked place that when the two angels came into Lot's house, what happened? Exactly the same thing. The men of the town surrounded the house and demanded that they bring out the angels so they could know them carnally. These were homosexuals. That's what they were. Violent men. And I may get in trouble, but I'm going to say it right here and now. Homosexuality is not a benign, victimless, they're just nice kids and people. The stronger it gets, the viler it gets, the more violent it gets. If you don't think so, just look at your newspaper.
Yeah.
How often are the most violent crimes committed by homosexuals against homosexuals. They do violent things. Because when you lose your moral compass, when morality is no longer one of your guiding lights, there's nothing to stop you from doing anything that your soul, your body, desires to do. And we know that we cannot possibly ever contemplate and understand how vile human beings can be when they're under the direction of Lucifer. That's what happens to these men. They never are satisfied. They have an appetite that just grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. And it's not just men. It's women too. These men surrounded the house. Homosexuality is not just a sin like murder or, a violation of one of the laws of God. Homosexuality is against a violation of the very purpose of God. You ever thought about that? What was the first commandment? One of the first commandments that God gave man.
Yeah.
Replenish the earth. Now, I'm sorry, they can try all they want to, but two men are not going to manage it, and neither is two women.
That's right.
You see, it's a violation of the purpose of God versus a violation of the law of God. We lose sight of that. We think, well, it's just another sin. It's something, that we just need to lead these people down to the altar and everything will be fine. Doesn't work that way. Now, I'm not saying they can't be saved. I'm not meaning that at all. But it takes more. Because before they can come to the point of salvation, there is so much that is there that has to be gotten rid of. Now, normally I don't say, you have to repent. Before you can come to God, you got to change all your ways before you can get saved. That's part of salvation. Yes, you have to repent. You have to turn back. You have to change your ways. That's all part of the process of repentance. But when it comes to these kinds of sins, the reason we don't have a lot of success in saving homosexuals is because they never reach the point of true repentance, of truly wanting to turn from what they're doing. It takes a supernatural jolt of God to turn these people to God. Not that it takes grace, not that He can't save them, I don't mean that at all. But it takes more for them to get to the point of salvation. I think one of the reasons is because their conscience has been so seared. You bring an average sinner into a service where God is moving, that conscience begins to work on them. And you'll see the tension. But you bring a homosexual in, you set them in there, and they'll sit there and stare at you in the most thick Spirit of God. They'll stare at you. Here in this church, just a couple of 3 years ago, I had a young lady after service came up to me and she says, she said it was one of those services where it was really, powerful, and she says, is it okay to be a lesbian? And can I be saved as a lesbian? And I looked at her a minute and I said, well, no, I'm afraid you can't. You need to make some changes. I don't think I can do that. Okay. And she's come several times before that, came after that. But I watched her, of course, after that. And when the Spirit moved, it was just kind of no feeling, nothing.
Yeah.
See. And so we don't have a great success rate. Does that mean we don't try? Not at all. We do what we can, because if we can save some of them. But these men were so evil, so wicked, that they not only violated the purpose of God. I mean, that's kind of a nebulous, you know, you can kind of think, well, that's abstract, you know, that's kind of back there. But they had some laws of hospitality that said if there was a stranger in the home, you were not to go in and bother them. There was the laws of Genesis and Exodus that said you don't take another man's wife or concubine and you don't have any sexual relations with them. That's against the law. Didn't matter. You see what happens in these situations when you allow that level of wickedness. The people of the town knew what would happen if they let those men and those people in their home. They'd be surrounding their home and beating on the door. And the old man knew. And he offered his own daughter. And we look at that and we say, now that's terrible. Well, you know, in that culture, in that time, that would be a perfectly logical thing to do. And we see it throughout the Old Testament, don't we? Women were not considered to be as valuable as men. If you didn't have a man, you were disgraced. If you didn't have a man-child, you were disgraced. You know, I mean, that was just the way women were looked at. And so in this situation, it appeared that the old man was more valuable than his daughter. The Levite was more valuable than his concubine. And so it became almost a business decision. And so what they do, well, the old man, he offers his daughter, but I see the Levite. Now the Levite's actions can be taken several ways. We can say, well, he was worried for himself, you know. But you can also say that he was more concerned for the old man's daughter than he was for his concubine. And so he took his concubine out the door. It says he went out to the men. They wanted him. But he was willing to go out and give his concubine to them in order to save the daughter of the old man who had been hospitable to them. So there, you know, there's a different slant here on what was going on. So the men accepted the concubine. And of course they took her all night long. Gang raped and whatever they did. The sun came up in the morning, they let her go. Isn't it interesting that evil always does its thing at night? Mm-hmm. It's almost like the story of you know, Dracula or these vampires, you know, they only do things at night. Well, it's almost true. Because the Bible says wickedness is at night. And it's the light that drives out darkness. It's the gospel that drives out wickedness. It's love that drives out this kind of vile behavior. Now, I'm sure that town could have taken care of the situation if they had wanted to. They could have just waited at night. All the men in the town that were not like these guys could have rose up with clubs and axes, and that would have ended the problem, right? And it would have been justified. But they were too afraid, and they had reached such a social position that it was probably okay. And in our world today, we have reached the social position to where this kind of deviation is considered okay. Turn on a TV program and show me one that doesn't have something to do with homosexuality in it anymore. Even those that are family rated. We have some stuff we watch, we like to watch, you know, and I'm getting sick. I may not even turn it on anymore. I'm getting so fed up with it. It's the same stuff. Here's some, you know, this couple or this couple. You watch your TV ads, and now, you know, now all of a sudden it's two men over here or two women over here. What is our world coming to? It's coming to the point of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's coming to the point of the world before Noah. You see, the Bible clearly says, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the coming of the Son of Man. How was it in the days of Noah? The same as it was in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah. They were doing the same things.
Yeah.
we need to be aware, we need to be alert, we need to look around and say, this is not right, and Jesus is coming to clear this mess up. Why? Because it's against the purpose of God. It's not a sin against His law, it's a sin against Him.
Yeah.
We don't have much time. We can't have much time. Abraham stood, if we can find 50 righteous men, if we can find 10, they couldn't even find 10 righteous men. What's this world coming to? When will it reach the point where somebody will say, God, if we can find 10 righteous men in the world?
Yeah.
Yeah. Not willing to clean up their town. So when they got done, they let this girl go. She found her way back to the house and made it as far as the door. She reaches out for the door sill. And that's where the Levite found her in the morning. He got up in the morning and he probably assumed they had killed her. That would have been his assumption. He wouldn't see her again. Maybe they sold her in slavery or took her as a slave. So he got up early in the morning with the intent of fleeing. I'm heading home. Opens the door and there's his concubine. There's a lot of people that they complain about the Levite. What could he have done? Yeah. He wasn't a prophet. Now, if he was the prophet, he could have done something. He just could have said, God, you got a spare bear? Send him over.
Yeah.
He wasn't a prophet. He was just a priest, a Levite. So he got up to go in the morning, and there was his concubine, and tried to rouse her and found out she was dead. So he put her on his donkey, and he headed home. Probably had about 10 miles to go to reach Shiloh. Probably took him about 5 hours to reach home. So he had time to think. He had time to reason. He had time to come to some conclusions and what he wanted to do. Now it's interesting, we don't hear any more about the old man. I know if it was me, I'd have been behind the Levite headed home. I would not stay in that place. Certainly with a daughter and wife. I'd have had him out there. I'd quit. That's it. We'll live on whatever we can find in the forest, but we're not staying here. Maybe he did. We don't know. But we know the Levite, he returned home. Judges 19, verses 29 to 30. When he entered his house, he took a knife, laid hold of his concubine, and divided her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And so it was that all who saw it said, no such deed has been done or seen from the day that the children of Israel came up from the land of Egypt unto this day. Consider it, confer, and speak up. Now this is gruesome. Yeah. This is actually a violation of the law in cutting up the body. First place, you weren't supposed to touch dead bodies, transport them. But this was actually a direct violation of the law. You were desecrating a dead body. Now the knife he used wasn't just a kitchen knife. Actually the knife was one of the large knives that they used to slaughter the animals, and they used to cut the animals up. It would be the same knife that Abraham would have had with him when he went up with it wasn't just some little dagger. And I can see him as he takes his concubine, and I don't know, maybe he had a slaughtering table where he put his, I don't know. But he laid her down and he took that knife and he began to cut all the pieces off. Now, I can only picture him in my mind. But can you imagine the inner turmoil, the rage, the indignation, and he evidently loved this girl, or he wouldn't have gone back to get her. All of these emotions. And as he's coming home, he's making a plan. And when he gets home, he takes that big knife and he begins to cut her into 12 pieces. How gory. Ugh. What in the world is he doing? And then he took each piece and he had a message evidently that went with it, explaining what had happened. And he took that message and he took that body part and he gave it to a servant. And he said, take this to the leaders of Manasseh. Take this to the leaders of Dan. Take this to the leaders of Reuben. Take this to the leaders of Naphtali. Take this to the leaders of Judah. Take this to the leaders of Benjamin. All 12 on a package with part of the concubine and a message that said what happened. Sometimes I think God wants us to take those things that have made us so irritated, those things that make us so disgusted, those things that happen in our lives, that we want to keep quiet. I can understand why the Levite may have wanted to go home and just quietly bury her and say nothing to anybody. I mean, after all, these guys were after him, and he substituted her. Mm-hmm. It would have been easy to just bury it under the rug. But not this Levite. He said, I am going to take action. I'm not a fighter. I can't raise an army. I'm not a big guy. I'm not Samson. But I'll tell you what I can do. I can get together the tribes of Israel. I can put an army together. I can get people excited. I can get people so full of indignation that they're going to go down and wipe that city out. That was his plan. And I think God wants us sometimes to get full of indignation at things that happen to us, that come against us, when evil has worked against us. And instead of just going and burying it in the sand and saying, we need to take that thing and cut it up. And we need to send it out to those around us with a message and say, I need you. Counsel, let's get together. Let's work together. Let's defeat the problem. Who is he? He's a Levite. He's a priest in the back hills of Ephraim. He's not even a leader. He's not considered a prophet. He's just an ordinary servant of the temple or the tabernacle. But because he was willing to do something that was outrageous, had never been done, he was willing to do the outrageous in order to bring a victory over evil. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's what we need to do, is to start thinking about how outrageous we can do things. Maybe if we're outrageous, maybe if we do things that have never been done before, maybe we'll get the results that he got. Because when the leaders saw the body parts and they read the message, what did they do? They called a meeting. They called a summit. All the leaders from the different tribes, they got together. And they said, look at this thing. Consider it. Think about it. What are we going to do? I want you to put some thought into this. I want some ideas. I don't know who wrote it. There was no single leader. It just seemed to be consensus. We're going to talk about this. We're going to think about it. We're going to come up with some answers. And we're going to talk. We're going to get together. And everybody is going to speak up. There's not going to be anybody who says, well, I think we probably didn't, maybe we shouldn't, I don't know. Everybody had to have an idea. Everybody had to speak up. They had to speak their minds. And we'll find out next week what the result of that was. But this gruesome story of the Levite's concubine. We need to take this to heart. And I think we need to apply some of these things to those things that come up against us, things that come against this church. We can vary it. We can say, well, it'll just happen as it happens, and I'm just going to ride the horse through it. Or we can stand up and say, let's do something outrageous. Let's get some ideas. Let's do something outrageous. See what God will do. And how we can band together. And with this outrageous thing that happened, we can gain a victory.
Was the Levite punished for breaking the law?
Not that we know of.
No?
You see, that was another thing about the law. The Jews are so downright about the law. But the law was broken over and over again. For various times. Through the kings, different times. You're not supposed to lie, right?
Right.
David went in and faked it that he was a madman. And he ended up getting the blessings of God. You see, the law was not as hard and set in stone, as we think.
Yeah.
It was a general principle. And even today, thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not kill.
Yeah.
But if you kill somebody and it was justified,
Yeah. That's
you
not-
killed them,
Yeah.
did you or didn't you?
Yeah.
But you see, it was applied to the situation. And the same thing would happen here. Now, if he desecrated the body for his own purposes or something, that would be different. But he had a plan in mind to overcome evil, and it required that he do something outrageous. We need to stop worrying if what we're doing is right or wrong and start acting outrageously for God, as long as it's for Him.
Yeah.
But notice, seek counsel. Get people together and talk. Any other questions?
Yeah.
All right, that's it for tonight.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.